Ted Bundy. Imagine someone who could be your average guy next door. Handsome, charming, even polite. That was Ted Bundy, born in 1946. A man who hid a terrifying darkness behind his smile. He blended right in, and I guess that is what makes his story so disturbing. In the 1970s, Bundy sneaked college campuses, mostly in the Pacific Northwest, to look for his type, young women with long, dark hair parted down the middle. His tactic was simple yet twisted. He would pretend to be injured with a fake cast on his arm or a crutch and ask for help. His victims, kind-hearted college students, never suspected a thing until it was too late. Once he gained their trust, he would lead them to his Volkswagen Beetle, where he would knock them unconscious and restrain them inside. He drove them to remote areas where he assaulted, tortured, and murdered them, sometimes returning to revisit his victims' bodies. Now, Bundy confessed to 30 murders, but investigators think the real number is closer to 100. And, just to make him even more infamous, he managed to escape from jail twice. Yes, twice. During one of these escapes, he made his way to Florida and carried out one of the most brutal attacks of his life at Florida State University's Chi Omega sorority house. This was one of his most shocking attacks. It showed just how bold and unhinged he had become. When Bundy finally went to trial, the whole country was glued to their screens. It was one of the first trials ever broadcast on TV, and Bundy, who thought he was smarter than everyone else, decided to represent himself in court. He loved the spotlight, even proposed to his girlfriend while cross-examining a witness. But eventually, he ran out of tricks. In 1989, he faced Florida's electric chair, and just like that, his reign of terror ended. Belle Gunness. Now, if you think the Midwest was all cornfields and quiet farms in the 1800s, think again. Enter Belle Gunness, born in Norway in 1859, and one of America's most prolific killers. She settled in Indiana, where she ran a farm and put on the front of a hard-working widow. But Belle was anything but sweet. She was all about money and didn't care how she got it. Over the years, she killed at least 14 people. Some say far more, including her husbands, suitors, and even some of her own kids. She lured men to her farm by posting personal ads that made her sound like the perfect bride, ready to love and care for a gentleman of means. Those men arrived, usually with their life savings, but they never left. In 1908, things got even stranger. Her farmhouse mysteriously burned down, and when police searched the wreckage, they found multiple bodies, including a headless woman who they thought was Belle. But people weren't so sure. Some said Belle had faked her own death, swapped in someone else's body, and vanished into thin air. Others think she actually died in that fire, but we will never know for sure. Either way, her story still sends a chill down people's spines. Dr. Death. And then there is Harold Shipman, who is probably one of the most terrifying of them all because he had everyone fooled. Born in 1946 in England, Shipman seemed like the kind of doctor you could trust, the kind of guy you would call Dr. Shipman with respect. But behind that caring facade was a serial killer. Over 20 years, Shipman secretly killed hundreds of his own patients, mainly elderly women. His method was as clinical as it was cold-hearted. He would give them lethal doses of morphine, then forge their medical records to make it look like they died naturally. People trusted him, and he was the last person anyone suspected. It wasn't until 1998, when the daughter of one of his patients grew suspicious that anyone looked into Shipman. Eventually, authorities linked him to 15 murders, but the real number is thought to be around 250. Yes, 250 people who trusted their doctor, gone because of him. Shipman was finally arrested and sentenced to life in prison, but he died by suicide in his cell in 2004. His case rocked the UK's medical field and led to big changes in how doctors are monitored to make sure nothing like this can ever happen again. The Night Stalker. Imagine living in Los Angeles in the mid-1980s, feeling safe in your own home, until you hear about Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. This guy was something out of a nightmare. Born in 1960, Ramirez terrorized California with random, brutal attacks that seemed to have no pattern. Most killers have a specific type, but Ramirez didn't care. He would break into any house, young or old, rich or poor, and his attacks were ruthless. Murder, assault, torture. He left behind scenes so horrifying that neighborhoods were gripped with fear. He stayed on the loose for months, slipping through police lines and even leaving pentagrams at his crime scenes that fueled his Satanist reputation. But his spree finally came to an end in 1985 when a group of civilians recognized him from police sketches. They actually chased him down in the street and held him until police arrived, an ending that shows just how desperate people were to stop him. Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders and sentenced to death, but he ended up dying in prison in 2013 from complications related to lymphoma, long before he ever faced execution. The Milwaukee Cannibal. Of course, Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Cannibal. If there was a list of killers who took horror to a new level, Dahmer would be near the top. Born in 1960, Dahmer's spree started young. He committed his first murder in 1978 when he was just 18. But things took a dark, twisted turn in the late 80s and early 90s. Dahmer targeted young men, usually seducing them back to his apartment with promises of money or drinks. Once there, it was like a scene out of a nightmare. Dahmer didn't just kill. He committed acts of cannibalism and necrophilia, meaning he engaged in sexual acts with the bodies of his victims, further adding to the horror of his crimes. He even tried to preserve some of his victims' bodies. Dahmer was finally caught in 1991 when one of his intended victims managed to escape and flagged down the police. What officers found in Dahmer's apartment was beyond belief. Body parts in the fridge, human skulls, and Polaroid pictures of his crimes. Dahmer was sentenced to life in prison, but didn't last long. In 1994, he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate, the Killer Clown. Then there is John Wayne Gacy, the Killer Clown, who is proof that appearances can be incredibly deceiving. Born in 1942, Gacy seemed like a normal guy. He was a businessman, a community member, and he even performed as Pogo the Clown at children's parties. But behind this friendly appearance was one of the most horrifying serial killers in history. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy tempted at least 33 young men and boys to his house in Illinois, where he attacked and murdered them. Many of his victims were buried in the crawl space under his house. Gacy's crimes were discovered in 1978 when police searched his home and uncovered remains that told the story of his horrific double life. He was convicted of all 33 murders and sentenced to death. In 1994, Gacy met his own end via lethal injection. The Murder Castle. Let's go back in time to the 1890s, Chicago's World's Fair, and meet H. Holmes, usually called America's first serial killer. Born Herman Webster Mudgett in 1861, Holmes moved to Chicago and built what came to be known as his Murder Castle, a hotel he designed specifically for murders. And if you think it looked like a normal hotel, you are wrong. It was a maze of hidden rooms, trapdoors, and even soundproof chambers, all set up to trap and kill unsuspecting guests, many of whom were young women who had come to Chicago for the fair. Holmes's castle was a place where people simply vanished. He confessed to 27 murders, but some believe the true number could have been as high as 200. Holmes was finally caught in 1894 after authorities started connecting disappearances back to him. He was sentenced to death and was hanged in 1896. Jack the Ripper. Even the name sends a chill down your spine, doesn't it? This is the killer who has been haunting London's streets since 1888, the shadowy figure we still don't know much about. Even his name is a mystery. His killing spree took place in London's gritty Whitechapel district, where he murdered at least 5 women in brutal, bloody attacks. All his victims were poor women, many working as prostitutes, and he killed them with a kind of brutality that still shocks people today. Jack mutilated his victims with surgical precision that left people to wonder if he had some medical knowledge. Some say he was a surgeon, others a butcher, but no one ever really knew. The police tried everything they could, interviewing suspects, combing the streets, and even getting desperate enough to ask for the public's help through the newspapers. But Jack vanished into the shadows just as quickly as he appeared. Over the years, there have been endless theories, royals, doctors, even other killers, but no one has ever cracked the case. Jack the Ripper remains one of the world's biggest mysteries that inspired books, movies, and theories for over a century as people can't resist trying to solve the unsolvable. Jolly Jane? Now, if Jack the Ripper haunts the streets, Jolly Jane Toppin is the monster who terrorized hospital wards. Jane Toppin was born in 1857 and trained as a nurse, a position that gave her plenty of opportunities to indulge in her horrifying hobby. Jane admitted to killing 31 people, mostly patients, which makes her one of the most psychotic female killers in America. She would carefully administer lethal doses of morphine and atropine, then watch them die, claiming it gave her an odd, sick kind of thrill. Jane even gave herself a nickname, Jolly Jane, and her coworkers never suspected she was capable of murder. In fact, she was known for her bright personality and for making friends with the people around her. When Jane was finally caught in 1901, she shocked everyone by confessing, and not just to murder, but to feel a strange, comforting thrill while watching life slip away from her patients. She was declared insane and sent to a mental institution, where she lived until 1938, the Butcher of Plainfield. Lastly, Ed Gein wasn't your usual kind of killer. Born in 1906 in rural Wisconsin, he is called the Butcher of Plainfield. But while most think of him as a serial killer, Ed only actually confessed to 2 murders. So, what makes him such a terrifying figure? Well, it is what he did with the bodies. After his mother's death, Gein became obsessed with the idea of bringing her back. He spent years digging up bodies from graveyards and eventually killing in order to create a woman suit from the skin and bones of his victims. He was convinced this would let him become his mother, who had controlled and manipulated him for most of his life. In 1957, the police finally raided Gein's farmhouse, and what they found could have come straight from a horror movie. His home was filled with human remains, skulls used as bowls, lampshades made from skin, and even a belt made of human nipples. It was a horror show beyond anyone's worst nightmare. Gein was found mentally ill and sent to a mental asylum, where he lived until his death in 1984. His story, though, didn't end with him. Ed Gein's gruesome life inspired some of horror's most infamous characters, from Norman Bates in Psycho to Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Even now, he is the reason we can't help but wonder what is hiding in the darkest corners of rural America. Thank you for sticking through till the end. Let me know in the comments section, what psycho killers did I miss? If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like button. And if you're interested in more videos like this one, hit the subscribe and notification bell to always know when the new video's up. Like I always say, it's free and you can always change your mind.